The desert roared with gunfire, each shot splitting the silence of dusk into jagged fragments. She ran, skirts torn, lungs burning, heart hammering against her ribs like a desperate fist. Dust clung to her lips, the metallic tang of blood already in her mouth from when she had stumbled and bitten her tongue. Behind her, the riders shouted, hard men with greed in their eyes and nothing human in their laughter. Their horses thundered closer, hooves drumming on rock like the approach of war itself. Her boots caught on a loose stone and she pitched forward, skin scraping raw against the ground. For a moment she tasted earth, dry and bitter. She tried to rise, but her ankle screamed protest. Then a shadow shifted on the ridgeline, cutting against the dying sun. She blinked through tears, thinking perhaps death had come wearing a different shape. The shape moved. It descended the slope with a kind of deliberate grace, not rushing, not afraid. Arrows gleamed in his quiver, the shaft of one already notched in a bow that curved like bone against the sky. His face was set, unreadable, but his eyes locked on the pursuers with a calm that burned hotter than any rage. The Apache moved as if he belonged to the rocks, as if the wind itself bent to his shoulders. One rider raised his rifle. The Apache loosed. The arrow struck true, driving the man from the saddle in a spray of dust. Confusion rippled through the pack, their shouts jagged with panic. Another arrow sang, then another, each one sure, measured, relentless. Horses screamed, men scattered, the rhythm of pursuit faltering. She pressed herself against the canyon wall, torn between terror and awe. When the last of the riders wheeled back into the haze, the Apache lowered his bow. He turned to her, a silhouette carved from twilight. She wanted to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice a ghost trapped inside. Instead she watched him descend, quiet as falling sand, until he stood over her. "You can't stay here," he said. His voice was low, steady, not unkind but without softness. She flinched at the weight of it, then pushed herself upright, favoring her ankle. "I didn't ask," she began, but the words fractured when she met his gaze. He did not look away, and in his eyes she saw neither pity nor judgment, only a certainty that pressed against her like the desert heat. The canyon echoed with distant hoofbeats. The riders had not gone far. Her breath hitched, shallow and fast. He noticed, of course, his head tilted, listening, as if he could read the land like scripture. He offered no hand, yet somehow his presence steadied her more than touch could. "Horse," he murmured, and she realized only then that his mare waited nearby, restless but loyal. He led her toward it, movements efficient, leaving no space for hesitation. She balked when he motioned for her to mount, her legs trembling. "I can't," she whispered, hating the smallness in her own voice. "You can," he answered simply. The finality of it broke her protest. With his help, not rough, not tender, just necessary, she found herself astride the horse. The leather smelled of sweat and smoke, the animal's muscles twitching beneath her. He swung up behind her in one fluid motion, his chest a wall of heat against her back. Then they were moving, hooves striking sparks from the stone, wind whipping her hair into her mouth. The world blurred into streaks of gold and shadow. Every stride was borrowed time, every heartbeat measured against the echo of pursuit. She wanted to scream, but the sound froze, caught between terror and the startling awareness of the man who rode behind her. His arm was braced firm to guide the reins, his breath steady even as the land tore past. Darkness thickened, the last shred of sun slipping away. The land opened into a wide stretch where stars already kindled, sharp and cold. Still the horse ran, and she felt the rhythm of its gallop reverberate up her spine until it was one with the drum of her own pulse. She had never been so close to another body, never felt so exposed and yet so shielded. At last he pulled the reins, slowing the animal until it came to a halt near an outcrop of stone. The silence after the chase was deafening, broken only by the wheeze of her breath and the horse's labored snorts. Her limbs shook, half from exhaustion, half from the shock of survival. He dismounted first, then reached up and lifted her down as if she weighed nothing at all. Her knees buckled when her boots touched earth, but he caught her elbow before she fell. For the first time, something like warmth flickered across his features, so fleeting she wondered if she imagined it. He guided her to a boulder where she could sit. "You'll live," he said, matter of fact. "Thanks to you." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. She wanted to sound defiant, but gratitude had already softened her tone. He studied her in silence, as though measuring more than her words. The night wrapped around them, coyotes calling far off, the scent of sage drifting through the cooling air. She felt suddenly small beneath the enormity of the sky, and yet not alone. He turned his head, listening again. The threat was not gone, only delayed. She knew it. He knew it. But for this moment, in the space carved between breaths, she felt something foreign and strange: safety. Her fingers fidgeted with the torn hem of her skirt. She wanted to ask his name, to offer hers, to break the silence that pressed on them like a second nightfall. But the words stuck, heavy as stone. Instead she looked at him, and he looked back, and something unspoken bridged the distance. The hoofbeats were gone now, fading into memory. The danger would return. She could feel it coiling at the edges of tomorrow. But tonight she was not running alone, and that was enough to keep her heart from breaking in two. She inhaled the sharp, smoky air, her chest aching, and whispered to herself, though she knew he could hear, "I'm still alive." He gave no reply, only the faintest nod, as if survival itself was all that ever needed to be said. And with that, the night deepened, promising both peril and something unnamed yet waiting just ahead. The fire cracked in small bursts, scattering sparks into the night as if the stars themselves were trying to fall closer. She sat hunched near the flame, her hands extended, palms raw, trembling more from nerves than from the cool desert air. He worked in silence a few feet away, tethering the mare, checking the bowstring, every motion practiced and spare. She wanted to speak, to name him, but his quiet was thick as stone, and she feared breaking it would bring the whole fragile stillness crashing down. When he finally returned, he crouched by the fire with a small pouch of herbs. Without asking, he reached for her ankle. She jerked instinctively, muscles flaring with resistance, but his gaze cut through the reflex. It wasn't a threat, it was certainty. His fingers were steady, his touch neither hesitant nor harsh, simply assured. She felt the grit being brushed away, the cool smear of some crushed leaf against torn skin. The scent was sharp, medicinal, threaded with sage. For the first time since the chase, she exhaled fully, a sigh she hadn't known she'd been holding. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice low. It was less a question of treatment and more of existence. Why save her, why risk himself? He didn't answer immediately. His hands kept working, binding a strip of cloth around her ankle with neat precision. Then, without looking up, he said, "Because you were hunted." As if that was all the explanation the world needed. She gave a faint, incredulous laugh, the sound catching in her throat. "Plenty of people get hunted out here. Plenty die." He tied off the bandage, not unkindly, but with an edge of truth that cut deeper than any blade. She looked into the fire, unwilling to meet the weight of those words. Flames licked upward, painting her face in shifting gold. She thought of the men's laughter, the wild light in their eyes, and shivered though the heat was strong. He noticed. He always seemed to notice. Without comment, he pulled a blanket from his saddlebag and set it beside her. She hesitated before drawing it over her shoulders, inhaling the faint leather and smoke clinging to the wool. The silence between them grew heavy again, but not hostile. It was a silence that asked to be filled carefully. She traced patterns in the dirt with a stick, her heart racing though there was no chase now, only the sound of the horse snorting and the wind curling around stone. Then the words tumbled out before she could catch them. "I've never been kissed," she whispered. She wasn't sure why she said it, maybe to claim some piece of herself before fear could take everything. The confession felt absurd, misplaced in a world that had already stolen so much, but once it escaped, it hung in the air, undeniable. His head turned toward her, the firelight catching the sharp line of his cheek, the dark steadiness of his eyes. For a long breath, he said nothing, and she wanted to vanish into the blanket, to undo the foolish words. But then he leaned slightly closer, his voice even, his mouth barely curved. "Then we'll start slow." She startled, first at the humor that laced his tone, and then at the strange warmth it brought. Her lips parted, but no reply came. The absurdity of laughter rose in her chest, surprising even herself. He didn't smile fully, but his gaze softened, and for a heartbeat the night seemed less cruel. She shook her head, brushing hair from her face. "You're not much for words, are you?" "Words waste breath," he said. "Well, "You've already wasted some on me," she countered, surprising herself with the courage to tease. That earned the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, so fleeting she wondered if she imagined it. Still, it felt like a victory. She wrapped the blanket tighter, letting the fire warm her front while his presence warmed her back in some wordless way. They ate in silence, sharing dried venison and hard bread. Each bite tasted of dust, yet hunger made it almost sweet. She found herself stealing glances at him, at the lines carved deep into his face, at the calm that seemed unshakable. He moved like a man accustomed to storms, carrying their weight without complaint. For a moment she envied that strength, and for another, she wondered if it was strength at all or just armor built too heavy to shed. As the night stretched on, the desert shifted its song, owls calling, insects humming, the sky spilling wider with constellations. She felt herself sink, exhaustion pulling at her bones, but she resisted sleep. It felt dangerous to let go, dangerous to trust. Yet her eyelids grew heavy, and when her head finally tipped sideways, she felt his hand catch the blanket before it slid from her shoulder. He adjusted it without a word. The storm announced itself with a low rumble beyond the horizon. A pulse of lightning split the far edge of the sky, bleaching the desert in sudden silver before plunging it back into black. She stirred, uneasy. He remained alert, scanning the darkness with that same unshakable stillness. "They'll come again, won't they?" she asked, her voice half asleep, half afraid. "Yes," he said simply. "And you'll fight them?" "Yes." The certainty in his tone steadied her more than any oath could. She closed her eyes, holding on to the rhythm of his calm, the sound of the fire, the distant growl of thunder. Safety was not promised, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the possibility of it. That was enough to let sleep finally claim her. He remained awake, eyes on the horizon where the storm built and the threat waited. Yet for the first time in his long solitude, the burden of watching over another did not feel like weight. It felt like purpose. And that was enough to keep him still, patient, waiting for what the night would bring. The fire cracked in small bursts, scattering sparks into the night as if the stars themselves were trying to fall closer. She sat hunched near the flame, her hands extended, dawn came
palms
sharp
raw,
and pale,
trembling
a
more
thin
from
band
nerves
of light
than from
stretching
the cool
across the
desert air.
horizon like a knife.
He worked
cutting
in
the dark
silence
a
a
few
few
feet away.
She
woke
tethering
to the
the
smell
mare,
of smoke,
checking
and
the
the faint
bowstring,
scrape of
every
flint.
motion
The
practiced and
Apache
spare.
was crouched by the
She wanted
embers,
to speak,
coaxing
to name him,
flame from
but
what
his
little
quiet
kindling
was
the
thick as
desert
stone,
offered,
and she feared
his
breaking
movements
it would
would
bring the
spare,
whole fragile
deliberate,
stillness
as though
crashing
each
down.
gesture carried
When he
history
finally
older
returned,
than the land
he
itself.
crouched by the fire
She
with
pulled
a
the
small
blanket
pouch
tighter,
of herbs,
stiff from the night
without
chill,
asking,
and tried
he
not to
reached
notice
for
how
her
safe
ankle.
she had felt while
She
he
jerked
kept watch.
instinctively,
The
muscles
fire
flaring
caught,
with resistance,
snapping softly,
but his gaze cut through the
He
reflex.
placed a strip of dried
It wasn't
meat
a
on
threat.
the stone,
It was
letting
certainty.
it warm.
Then
His
handed
fingers
it
were
to
steady,
her without
his
ceremony.
touch neither hesitant
She accepted,
nor harsh,
biting
simply
into its
assured.
toughness.
She
Chewing
felt the grit
slowly.
being brushed away.
The silence between
cool
them was
smear
less
of some
brittle
crushed
now,
leaf against
shaped
torn
not by
skin.
fear, but by
The
something
scent was
unspoken,
sharp,
medicinal,
medicinal trust,
threaded with sage.
"You don't ask much."
For the first
she
time
said,
since the
voice
chase,
sick from
she
sleep.
exhaled fully.
"You tell
a
when you
sigh
need
she
to,"
hadn't known
he
she'd been
replied.
holding.
His eyes
Why?
didn't leave the horizon.
She asked
Where
finally.
storm clouds
her voice
had
low.
collapsed into gray
It was
haze.
less a question of
the air
treatment
heavy
and
with
more of
moisture
existence
that had yet to fall.
Why save her?
She hesitated.
Why risk himself?
Then drew in a
He
breath
didn't
sharp
answer
enough
immediately.
to sting. I
His
was
hands
16
kept working,
when they sold
binding
me.
a strip of
The
cloth
words
around her
tumbled raw,
ankle with neat
as though
precision.
speaking them aloud,
Then,
carved
without
old
looking
wounds
up,
fresh.
he said,
"To a man
because
older
you were
than my
hunted."
father,"
As if that
he
was
wanted
all the
labor more than a
explanation
wife.
the world needed.
But he kept me close.
She gave a faint,
close
incredulous
enough that I
laugh.
learned how to
The sound
vanish
catching
in
in her
sight.
throat.
How
Plenty
to keep
of people
breathing
get
without
hunted
being
out here.
touched. She
Plenty
laughed
die.
bitterly, though no humor
He tied
carried
off
in
the
it.
bandage,
That's
not
why.
unkindly,
Why
but
I
with an
said
edge
what
of
I
truth
said
that
last
cut
night.
deeper than any
Why
blade.
I've never been
She
kissed.
looked into the fire,
His jaw
unwilling
tightened,
to meet
though
the
his
weight
expression
of those
didn't
words.
shift.
Flames
He let
licked
her words
upward,
settle like
painting
dust,
her face in
unhurried,
shifting gold.
respectful.
She thought of
Finally,
the
he
men's laughter,
said,
the
"Running
wild
doesn't
light in
erase
their
chains,"
eyes,
and shivered
it only
though the
hides
heat was
them.
strong.
Her
He
eyes
noticed.
burned.
He
You
always
think I
seemed
don't
to
know
notice.
that?
Without
Without
her
comment,
gaze, then,
he pulled a blanket
unflinching,
from his saddlebag
"I
and
think
set
you
it
know it
beside
too
her.
well."
She
The
hesitated
fire
before
crackled
drawing
between
it
them,
over her shoulders,
releasing a curl of
inhaling the
smoke
faint
that
leather
stung her
and
eyes
smoke
more
clinging
than
to
the
the
confession
wool.
had.
The silence
She dropped
between
her
them
gaze,
grew heavy again,
clenching the meat
but
until
not
her
hostile.
knuckles whitened.
It was a silence
He didn't press
that asked
further.
to be filled
His
carefully.
silence wasn't avoidance.
She traced patterns
It
in
was
the dirt
space,
with a stick,
an opening
her
for
heart
her to
racing
fill
though
if
there
she
was no
wished.
chase now.
Instead,
only
she
the
forced
sound of
a
the crooked
crooked
snorting
smile.
and the wind
If
curling
this were one
around
of those
stone.
modern stories,
Then the words
I'd probably
tumbled
post
out
my
before
trauma
she could
online
catch them
and wait for strangers
I've never
to click
been
a little
kissed.
heart. she whispered.
She mimed,
She wasn't sure why she
with
said
her
it.
finger.
Maybe to claim some
I'd
piece
go
of herself
viral.
before fear
Escaped
could take
bride
everything.
tells all.
The confession
He
felt
frowned
absurd,
faintly,
misplaced in a
puzzled.
world that had already
Posed.
stolen so much.
She laughed,
but once
a
it
real
escaped,
laugh this time,
it hung in the
shaking
air,
her head.
undeniable.
Never mind.
His head turned
Just
toward her.
a joke.
The firelight
Something
catching
to
the
keep
sharp
the
line
world
of his
from
cheek,
swallowing
the
me.
dark steadiness
A
of his
rustle
eyes.
broke the moment.
For a long breath,
His head turned
he said
sharply,
nothing,
and
eyes
she
narrowing
wanted to
at a
vanish
figure
into the
approaching
blanket
along
to
the ridge.
undo the foolish
She
words.
stiffened,
But
but
then
then
he
reaching
leaned
for the
slightly
blanket
closer,
like it might
his
shield
voice
her from
even.
bullets. His mouth
But the
barely
figure was
curved.
bent,
Leading
then
a mule,
stalked
a
slow.
wide hat shading a weathered face.
First at the humor
a peddler,
that laced his
his
tone,
cart rattling
and
with
then
pots
at the
and
strange
bright cloth
warmth
that
it brought.
clinked like mismatched
Her lips
wind
parted,
chimes.
but no reply
Morning
came.
The old
The
man
absurdity
called,
of
voice
laughter
rough with
rose in
dust
her
and
chest,
distance, surprising even
He
herself.
offered a toothless
He
grin
didn't smile
when he drew
fully,
near.
but his gaze
Didn't
softened,
expect to
and for a
find
heart
company
company the
out
night
here.
seemed less cruel.
The Apache rose,
She shook her head,
still a stone,
brushing
but
hair from her
unmistakably
face.
watchful.
You're
The
not
woman
much
forced
for
her
words,
breath steady,
are you?
studying the
Words
stranger.
waste breath.
He
He
smelled
said.
of copper pans
Well,
and old
you've
tobacco.
already wasted some
he
on
shifted
me.
his weight,
She counted,
eyes darting
surprising
between them
herself
with quick
with the courage to
calculation.
tease. Words
That
been riding
earned the
ahead of you
faintest
too,
twitch at the
he
corner
said,
of his mouth,
scratching his
so
beard.
fleeting she
Men in
wondered
town
if she
talk
imagined
of a
it.
runaway girl
Still,
and the price
it felt
she's
like
worth.
a victory.
And another
She
price
wrapped the blanket
for the
tighter,
one who helps
letting
her.
the fire warm
His
her front
eyes
while his
lingered
presence
on the Apache
warmed her back in some
High
wordless
price.
way.
Folks
They
get
ate in
foolish
silence,
when silver
sharing
jingles
dried
loud.
venison and
Her
hard bread.
stomach knotted.
Each bite tasted
How
of
far?
dust.
Half
Yet
a
hunger
day,
made it
maybe
almost
less.
sweet. She
The
found
peddler
herself
shrugged.
stealing glances at
They're
him,
mean and dumb,
at the lines
but
carved
mean goes
deep
a long
into
way
his
out
face,
here.
at the calm that
The
seemed
Apache gave a
unshakable.
single nod.
He moved like a man
Real move.
accustomed to storms.
The old man leaned
carrying
closer,
their weight without
lowering
complaint.
his voice as
For
if
a moment
sharing a
she
secret.
envied that strength.
If I
And
were
for
you,
another,
I'd
she
head
wondered
north.
if it was strength at
Water
all,
there,
or just
a
armor
canyon
built
too
too
heavy
heavy
to
for
shed.
horses. As the night
But
stretched on,
he tapped
the
the side
desert
of his
shifted
nose.
its song.
Be
Owls
careful.
calling,
Tracks
insects
tell
humming,
louder
the
than
sky
tongues.
spilling wider with
He
constellations.
tugged the mule onward.
She felt herself
vanishing
sink,
with a rattle of
exhaustion
pots
pulling
and
at
the
her
faint
bones,
jangle of coins
but she
in his
resisted
pocket.
sleep. The woman's
It felt
hands
dangerous to
trembled
let
around
go.
the blanket, dangerous to
They'll
trust.
never stop.
Yet her
Will
eyelids
they?
grew heavy.
They stopped
and when
when
her head
someone
finally
makes them,
tipped
he
sideways.
said. His
She
tone
felt his hand
flat as
catch the
iron.
blanket before it
Something
slid from
in
her
her
shoulder.
hardened then.
He adjusted
She
it
straightened,
without a word,
pulling the blanket
the
tighter,
storm announced
lifting her
itself
chin
with a
though
low
her
rumble
pulse
beyond
hammered
the
wide.
horizon.
Then I
a pulse
won't
of
run
lightning
again.
split the far
Not
edge of the
this
sky,
time.
bleaching
For
the
a
desert
moment,
in sudden
the Apache
silver before
regarded
plunging
her
it
as
back
if
into
weighing
black.
stone in his
She
palm.
stirred, not
Uneasy,
mocking,
not
He
doubtful,
remained alert,
just
scanning
measuring.
the darkness with
Then
that
he
same
inclined his head,
unshakable
a
stillness.
gesture that carried
They'll
the weight
come
of
again, won't
acknowledgement.
they? The
She
morning
asked,
brightened
her
into
voice
harsh
half
light,
asleep,
the
half
desert
afraid.
stretching endless
Yes,
in every
he said
direction.
simply.
Somewhere
And
beyond
you'll
that
fight
horizon,
them.
men prepared
Yes.
saddles,
The certainty
sharpened
in his
blades,
tone
and
steadied
licked
her
their
more
teeth
than
at the thought
any
of silver
oath could.
But here,
She closed her
by the
eyes,
smoldering fire
holding on to
and
the
the
rhythm of
stubborn
his
rise
calm,
of her shoulders,
the sound of the fire,
another battle
the
had
distant
begun.
growl of
Not
thunder.
just survival,
Safety
but
was not
defiance.
promised.
But for
The
the first
Apache
time in
doused
longer
the
than
flame,
she could remember,
scattering
she
ash
felt the
into the wind.
possibility of it. The scent of
That
smoke
was enough
clung
to
to them
let
as they
sleep
packed,
finally claim
sharp
her.
and lingering.
He remained
a reminder
awake,
that safety
eyes
was
on the
never more
horizon
than
where
borrowed.
the storm built and the
He
threat
mounted
waited.
the horse and
Yet
reached
for the first
down a
time
hand.
in his long solitude,
She hesitated,
the burden
only
of
a breath
watching over
before
another
taking
did
it.
not feel
Her
like
grip
weight.
firmer now.
It felt like
as the mare
purpose.
carried them north,
And that was enough
clouds
to keep
gathered
him
heavy
still,
and low,
patient,
the promise of
waiting
rain
for what the
pressing
night
against
would
the
bring.
sky. The land shifted beneath their pace, rocks rising sharper, the canyon walls looming closer. Every sound seemed amplified, the scrape of hooves on stone, the hiss of sand against leather, the steady rhythm of her breath beside his. Somewhere behind them, faint and distant but undeniable, came the echo of pursuit. It threaded through the air like a warning drumbeat. She turned her head, eyes narrowing at the horizon. Fear was still there, coiled deep, but something else had joined it now, resolve. He noticed, of course. He always noticed. And though his face gave nothing away, his hand brushed briefly against hers where they both gripped the saddle, a gesture light as wind yet strong enough to anchor her. The storm answered with a low roll of thunder, carrying the promise of reckoning just ahead. Rain fell in jagged lines as the storm broke open, the canyon walls channeling water into streams that twisted at the horse's hooves. The Apache kept his gaze forward, his body taut with the same awareness that sharpened the air. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew clearer, the thunder of hooves echoing through the stone corridors. The girl pressed closer into the saddle, her breath measured, her grip steady. She was afraid, but it was not the hollow terror of running, it was the charged fear of someone prepared
preparing to stand. A bend in the canyon split into two narrow paths. Without hesitation, the Apache guided the horse to the left, where rocks jutted like broken teeth and cover was scarce. She almost protested, but then realized his choice was deliberate. A narrow path meant fewer riders could advance at once,
and fewer riders meant a chance to fight on their terms. He slowed the horse, then pulled sharply on the reins, bringing it to a halt near an outcropping of stone. His movements were precise, controlled, yet his silence carried weight. She dismounted without waiting for instruction, her boots splashing in shallow water, her heart hammering against her ribs. "They're close," she whispered. "They will come," he said simply, stepping onto the rocks. He strung his bow in one fluid motion, eyes flicking across the canyon walls as though mapping the battle before it began. "You must not fear your voice." She frowned, unsure what he meant until the first shouts ricocheted through the canyon. The men came into view in bursts, their silhouettes jagged against the stormlight, rifles slung across their shoulders, faces set with the certainty of the hunt. The leader raised his hand, signaling a halt, and the men reined in their horses, fanning out with practiced ease. His grin spread like oil across his face as his eyes found her. "Thought you could outrun me, girl?" His voice dripped with the arrogance of ownership. "Debt don't vanish just because you do. And your little guardian here, he'll fetch a bounty all his own." Her stomach twisted, but this time she did not look away. She stepped forward, the rein clinging to her lashes, and raised her chin. "I'm not your debt. I was never yours to sell." The words startled her even as they left her mouth, but she felt them anchor in her chest like roots. The leader's grin faltered, replaced by a scowl. He barked a command, and two men urged their horses forward. The Apache's arrows sang before their rifles could rise. One rider toppled, clutching his shoulder, the other's horse reared, thrashing against the narrow walls. The canyon funneled chaos, forcing their numbers into disorder. She felt her breath seize as gunfire cracked, stones splintering near her feet. Instinct shoved her behind the outcropping, but she forced herself to peek out, refusing to surrender to blind hiding. The Apache moved like shadow, each arrow a deliberate answer to the storm of bullets. Yet she could see it, there were too many, and the narrow pass that shielded them also threatened to trap them. Her pulse raced as she spotted something farther along the canyon wall, a cluster of loose rock, water seeping beneath it, already trembling under the weight of the storm. She shouted, her voice carrying above the din, "The ridge! Bring it down!" He glanced where she pointed, understood instantly, and loosed two arrows in quick succession. The first struck one of the advancing riders, but the second clattered uselessly off stone. He needed more force, more leverage. She didn't think, she acted. Snatching up a jagged rock, she scrambled up the incline, boots slipping in mud, rain blinding her eyes. Shouts rose below, both from pursuers and from the Apache, who called her name with an edge she had never heard before. Her hands burned as she clawed at the ridge, wedging the rock into a crack where the water had already begun to pry the earth apart. She heaved with all her weight, a cry tearing from her throat, not from fear but from defiance. The earth answered. The ridge shuddered, then roared as tons of stone broke free, crashing into the canyon with a deafening fury. The pursuers scattered in panic, horses screaming, men shouting as dust and rock swallowed the path. When the echo finally stilled, the canyon lay choked with rubble, their passage blocked. The leader's voice cut through the chaos, ragged with rage, but his figure was now distant, separated by the wall of stone. Breathless, trembling, she half slid, half fell back down the incline. The Apache caught her arm before she collapsed into the water, steadying her as if she weighed nothing. His eyes burned, not with anger but with something sharper, something that held both astonishment and respect. "You used your voice," he said, low but certain. She wanted to laugh, to cry, to collapse all at once. Instead she met his gaze, her chest rising and falling, and managed to whisper, "I was tired of silence." For a moment, neither moved. Rain softened to a steady drizzle, washing blood and dust into the stream at their feet. Behind them, the canyon still echoed faintly with the curses of men who would find another way, another day. But in that narrow space of reprieve, something shifted. Not just survival, but the beginning of choice. She leaned against the stone, exhausted but unbroken. He did not touch her again, yet his presence settled around her like a vow. The storm was not finished, nor the pursuit ended, but the chains that once clung to her spirit had cracked. She had faced them and pushed back, not alone, but not hidden either. The Apache glanced at the blocked canyon, then back at her. "They will try again," he warned. "I know," she said, her voice steady. "But next time,
They'll find me ready. His silence was agreement enough. Together, they gathered the reins, mounted, and turned toward the open stretch of land where the stormlight fractured into pale bands of gold. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she did not dread its unknowns. She welcomed them.